Star Wars: The Last Jedi is in theaters now. What does your family need to know about this huge movie?
Huge. We're going to talk about it next on this Plugged In Vodcast.
I'm Adam Holz.
I'm Paul Asay.
And today we're going to talk about Star Wars: The Last Jedi. Paul, you reviewed this movie for Plugged In, and I, of course, saw it the first night. I made you go see it because I wasn't sure I wanted the responsibility and the burden of reviewing something that I hoped to love. And it turns out I think you loved it more than I did, but that's not going to be the main thrust of our podcast.
Yeah, no, we have some very different ideas on how this movie worked or not. But what we want to talk about here today is really whether it will work for you and your family. Yeah. And it does have some tricky elements, right?
It does have some tricky elements. And, you know, I think the interesting thing is that after 40 years, we're still talking about the Force. And after 40 years, they keep introducing sort of tendrils of meaning to the Force that sort of forces us, to keep having this conversation.
Right.
Why don't you talk about some of the things that are sort of new wrinkles or things that are fleshed out with regard to the Force in this movie?
Yeah, we all know. I mean, if we're familiar with the Star Wars universe at all, we understand that the Force has always been a huge component of...
It's everywhere.
It's part of its mythos. It's this energy that wraps around the entire universe.
It's an energy field that binds... I won't quote Obi-Wan Kenobi anymore.
No, okay. But it is this super powerful thing, and it's very nebulous. It feels to me a lot like Taoism. You know, they have this philosophy in Taoism, which is an Eastern religion system of thought called
and that's
Wei.
The yin yang symbol with the little
yin yang symbol.
Paisleys chasing each other in a circle.
So it really does reflect Taoism a lot, and we even see sort of a reflection of the yin yang symbol in the movie.
In that pool, right?
Right. We see not exactly, but there's this yin yang type of thing in a pool there, and in this movie, I think that the thing that sort of ratchets the spirituality up in this particular movie that we have not seen in the past is that it's overtly referred to as a religion, and it's explicitly called by Luke Skywalker as a religion.
And we see holy books.
We see sacred texts, essentially. We see that it has been this belief
Although it could
system.
just be Luke's journal, for all we know.
For all we know. Because we can't read it. It's in some weird language.
It's in some weird language.
So, but essentially they are sort of specifying that it is religion, which it has always had those elements, but now it sort of takes the next step forward. And that, I think, causes... I mean, it's something that parents need to be aware of, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Do you feel, for me, these elements of the Force have always been potentially navigable for some families? Would you agree with that? Is that still navigable here?
I mean, I think so, and this is more my personal opinion than Plugged In. I think all movies present a worldview that you have to decide as a family, are we willing to wade into this or not? Now, this one's a little bit skewed because I saw Star Wars when I was 7.
Right.
And
Me
my
too.
parents weren't really worried about whether the worldview was appropriate to me as a 7-year-old. So I've grown up with Star Wars, and that probably causes me perhaps to minimize it a little bit personally. You know, if Star Wars came out now, would I have a different perspective on the worldview than I did because I grew up with it?
Right.
Probably.
Right.
You know, I think this is a great sort of case study in worldview because it's so clearly a belief system that's different than Christianity. And I think it's totally legitimate to say as a Christian parent, man, there are ideas in this that do not line up with what we believe.
Right.
And this idea, I think, that evil and good are somehow supposed to be in balance, there's a kind of intellectual elegance to that. Like, you hear that, I'm like, oh, yeah, good and evil in balance. If you take a half a step backwards as Christians, that is antithetical to the gospel.
Absolutely.
Even though we believe that evil exists, that we believe that, you know, there is a spiritual enemy in Satan who is working against us and that there is a battle between good and evil, the battle has been won. The battle was won at the cross, and everything since the cross is a mopping up operation.
Right.
Now, at times in human history, it's been a brutal one. I don't want to minimize human suffering.
Absolutely.
But as Christians, we believe that the good guys not only are going to win, but have already won, and we're just sort of in the outworking of that. Whereas this good and evil in balance thing, that's a totally different worldview.
It's a totally different worldview.
But I think the question parents have to ask is this something that we can navigate as a family?
Yeah. No, and it is really tricky. I remember back when the original movies were coming out, my dad took me to a special church service where this guy was speaking on some of these more Eastern elements within the Star Wars universe and talking about the problems therein. And so we don't want to minimize those problems.
Right.
It's something that I think presents a talking opportunity for you and your kids.
Yeah.
Because I think that in some ways...
I think it can, if parents choose to go there.
Because I think that in some ways the Star Wars philosophy, because it has been such a huge component of our culture, it has actually become... that philosophy has become part of our culture. And I think that sometimes it is sort of crept into this secular worldview that we have. And so I think it's something that in some ways we have to deal with. At the same time, I think that we can find echoes of Christianity even within these movies. I think that when you look at the whole saga of Anakin Skywalker throughout the entire series, I mean, that's essentially a redemption story.
It is a redemption story.
Where he comes from a place of sin and he is eventually redeemed. And so if you're looking for it, you can find some elements that can be also good talking points, right?
It's not all bad. I think it's clearly a hodgepodge of Eastern spirituality with maybe a veneer of some Christian stuff, and Star Destroyers. You know? I mean, at its core, George Lucas has talked about this whole constellation of influences from listening to Flash Gordon serials to Campbell, what's his name? Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. And so he was trying to take this, Campbell's basically a philosopher who looked back on the history of heroes and said, here are the common threads in all of these mythological stories. And Lucas took that and created Star Wars. He was very self-consciously trying to create an American myth, almost. I mean, Luke's not American, and I'm a little bit off on a rabbit trail here, but Lucas was it wasn't an accident what he did. And
he tapped into some very primal points within our psyche to use these, and that because of that, it touches on faith, it touches on religion, it touches on all these things that are super powerful to us, this search for transcendence that we always have, right?
Yeah, and that sense of longing, that the hero's longing is a desire to be better, a desire to be in a different place, a desire to have an opportunity to make a difference and not be stuck on Tatooine, fixing moisture evaporators. Which doesn't sound like a good idea to me, and it didn't sound like a good idea to Luke Skywalker a long time ago in a movie far, far away.
One of the interesting things that I think Last Jedi gets into is this sense of disillusionment, discouragement.
Talk about that for a minute.
When we're looking at The Last Jedi, we have a few characters within it that feel like this, as they refer to it explicitly as a religion, their religion has let them down, and they're looking for new answers in some cases, and they're seeing that what they have seen is flawed. It has been filled with hypocrisy and selfishness and all these kind of things. And in some ways,
which are criticisms we've heard of the church.
That's absolutely
throughout
right.
The centuries too, right?
In some ways, for me at least, it feels like that's very resonant. Because I think that we all sometimes feel that our own faith, we understand how beautiful and how perfect it should be.
Right.
But we know that it falls short a lot of times in our human manifestations of that.
And even in our personal lives, I mean, I think that a lot of people have had experiences where when you first come to faith, especially if you haven't grown up in the church, I think if you grow up in the church, it may be a little different. But I really started growing spiritually in college. I had grown up in the church, but I'd kind of walked away from it a little bit. And there's just this explosion of the gospel in your heart. You're excited about Scripture. You're excited about God. You stop doing all these things you used to do, and you start doing new things. Like there's repentance. There's a turn. And I think for a lot of people that can last for a number of years, and then somewhere along the line there's an experience or an emotion or something happens that doesn't sort of fit what seems like a kind of black and white understanding of reality. And at that point our faith has to deepen in terms of being able to deal with nuance. And maybe you have something bad happen. Maybe there's a season of doubt. I have had a season where I really struggled to hear from God like I felt like I did when I was younger, and I've had to wrestle with what does that look like. So I think there's both the personal element and the institutional element, and I think that
we see that both in this movie.
In the movie, and I think for all the plot points that totally threw me personally, I think that part of the movie emotionally had resonance to me because there's complexity there, and potentially, if you go see it, probably this is not a discussion you're going to have with your 8-year-old, but if you got a 15 or 16-year-old who's beginning to spread his or her wings and have some questions about their faith, maybe there's a jumping off point here that what seems black and white, as we get older, we may have moments where there's disillusionment. So on one hand, I think it's pretty clearly not a Christian worldview. And I think it's a totally legitimate thing to say we don't want to go into that. But I think that it's also a legitimate path to take to say we're going to wade into it, we're going to compare it to what we believe, and we're going to look for ways that maybe this, even though it's a non-Christian story, can give us some insight for our own faith.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, look at the review. Make sure that this is a movie that you feel is right and navigable for your family before going to see it. Be aware that there are a lot of issues here, but they're not all bad issues. So just use your best judgment. As always, it's always up to you to decide whether it's right for you or your family. So
I'm Adam.
I'm Paul.
And we'll see you next time.